Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, so today we're unpacking one of the shortest, yet honestly most surprisingly relatable texts about human behavior you're ever going to come across. We're looking at a source that is incredibly brief, but just absolutely brilliant at capturing a hurdle we all face, which is, learning how to actually exist within a complex social structure. So, by diving into this super concise material, we're going to unpack the massive, sometimes messy challenge of teaching, learning, and eventually mastering the really simple act of basic gratitude. Let's get right into it. The elephant who could never say thank you. I mean, in just 8 words, we are presented with an entire narrative universe. Right away, we've got a protagonist, a profound character flaw, and the entire dramatic tension of a social deficit laid completely bare. It is just a masterful exercise in micro-storytelling. It establishes an incredibly relatable conflict that forces us to immediately confront the uncomfortable reality of withheld gratitude. So, when we look a bit closer at this protagonist, we aren't just talking about a grumpy animal having a bad day. We're looking at a towering metaphor for someone who is completely stuck in their ways. Just imagine the sheer physical space an elephant occupies, right? And then imagine that massive presence paired with a total void of interpersonal warmth. This character acts as a mirror for those stubborn, super rigid phases of early development, where acknowledging the help or kindness of others feels, well, somehow impossible. It really sets the stage for a massive internal conflict. Now, there is a brilliant contradiction at play here. Think about what an elephant symbolizes in our collective consciousness. We're talking immense wisdom, deep familial bonds, and a legendary, infallible memory. Yet our source text strips all of that away by pairing this magnificent creature with the word ungrateful. I mean, how can a creature that remembers literally everything forget to acknowledge a simple kindness? This contradiction really highlights how selective and stubborn the refusal to show gratitude can truly be. It tells us that this isn't some failure of memory. It is an active and maybe even defensive behavioral choice. But let's be super clear about what ungrateful actually means in this specific universe. Based strictly on our source, we're not talking about a complex, deeply rooted malice or a desire to cause harm. No, it is a highly specific, almost crippling inability to perform one tiny social grace. Being ungrateful here is defined entirely by the absence of a spoken phrase. It kind of shows us how society measures our moral standing not just by the bad things we actively do, but by the small, positive things we simply fail to say. The elephant's entire identity in this text is forged by the absence of those two little words. Notice the specific, absolute wording the text uses. It doesn't say the elephant struggled to say it or rarely said it. It introduces a concept of absolute finality. And this brings us into a really fascinating psychological space. You see, when a behavior is framed as an absolute negative, it totally ceases to be just a bad habit and transforms into a heavy, defining burden. The elephant is trapped by this absolute condition, just wandering through social interactions, carrying the massive weight of this perpetual silence. That heavy burden is perfectly captured in the phrase could never say. It implies a literal blockade. So we have to ask, is it a physical inability, a psychological wall? In the context of moral development, this represents those frustrating, dug-in moments where a child, or let's be real, even an adult, simply refuses to yield to a social convention. It's the ultimate standoff between individual stubbornness and the expectations of the community around them. So why are two of the most basic words in our language so incredibly hard for this giant creature to say? Well, if we look at this through the lens of learning and development, saying thank you requires something incredibly difficult. It requires the speaker to lower their defenses. To thank someone is to admit that you needed them, that they provided something you lacked, and that you're in their debt, however briefly. For a giant, proud elephant, or say a fiercely independent toddler, that level of vulnerability might feel absolutely terrifying. We have this impenetrable wall of stubbornness, and yet the solution is literally just a tiny golden key. The real tragedy of our source text is how incredibly close the solution is to the problem. The lock is massive, the reality that they could never say it, but the key itself, thank you, is so wonderfully light. It goes to show that the greatest barriers to our social and moral growth aren't usually overcome by massive feats of strength, but by small, humbling moments of connection. And this is exactly why we use animal allegories to teach these concepts. We've dissected the text, sure, but the practical application is what truly matters for us. By projecting these stubborn, complicated human behaviors onto an elephant, we create a safe, objective distance to examine our own flaws. It allows us to look at the mechanics of moral growth without immediately getting defensive about it. The whole solitary premise of an ungrateful elephant just perfectly maps onto the profound, everyday challenges of teaching moral awareness. The immense size perfectly mirrors how overwhelmingly daunting and arbitrary social rules can feel to someone who's just learning them. The rigidity of that barrier, the word never, well, that represents those phases of pure resistance we all inevitably hit. And right at the core of it all is the truth that gratitude requires vulnerability. It requires the giant elephant to bow its head just slightly, to acknowledge the world outside itself. It's basically the exact blueprint of social conditioning. Ultimately, it all comes back to the destination our elephant is trying to reach. Thank you. It's the punctuation mark at the end of our source text, entirely enclosed in its own quotes. It just sits there as an ideal, a destination that the elephant has yet to actually reach. By isolating these words, the source text reminds us of their unique power. They are the social glue of human civilization, the absolute simplest transaction of goodwill, and the ultimate cure for the elephant's defining flaw. It's super easy to look at the elephant and recognize the stubbornness of a child, right? But the true power of this source material is holding up a mirror to ourselves. Where are the rigid barriers in your own life? Where are you refusing to yield? If the inability to say two small words can entirely define a giant creature, I'll leave you with this to think about. What unseen weight are you carrying right now simply because you refuse to be vulnerable enough to express your own gratitude? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.